Is the world overpopulated? Should we be more concerned with depopulation rather than overpopulation? Hi, you're tuned into The Commonwealth Matters, and I'm your host, Richard Nelson. Joining us to talk further is Lyman Stone, a senior fellow and director of the Pronatalism Initiative at the Institute for Family Studies. Lyman is also the chief information officer of the consulting firm Demographic Intelligence and a PhD student at McGill University. His work on family formation and demographics has been covered in many publications, including the New York Times and Wall Street Journal. Lyman currently lives in Lexington, Kentucky with his wife and 3 daughters. Lyman, welcome to The Commonwealth Matters.
It's great to be with you.
I want to start the conversation on demographics with a book that was released in 1969 by a university professor named Paul Ehrlich. He wrote a book called The Population Bomb, and he made the claim that overpopulation in the world will lead to famine and millions of deaths, hundreds of millions of deaths by the 1980s. And this is what he asked: what needs to be done? And he said, we must rapidly bring the world population under control, reducing the growth rate to 0 or making it negative. Conscious regulation of human numbers must be achieved. Simultaneously, we must at least temporarily greatly increase our food production. Now, Lyman, you and I and those who pay attention to this know that his prediction was wildly inaccurate, never happened. In fact, there was greater food production in that period of time, and the average life expectancy increased over that period of time as well. And yet, there is still a view today that the world is overpopulated, in particular that it's wreaking havoc on the environment and on our well-being. So we know that his prediction, his theory was false, didn't happen, but there's still this prevailing myth, if you will, that overpopulation prevails and we've got to do something about it. How do you explain that?
So humans, we tend to be scarcity reasoners. You know, most of our history was subsistence farming or hunter-gathering or whatever. And so we tend to just default towards being really worried about where our next meal is going to be from. And so scarcity reasoning dominates a lot of our thinking, which is unfortunate because throughout human history, the scarcity mindset has actually usually been wrong. That is, humans have always been able to modify their environments, modify their communities, modify the way that they live in the world in order to exceed the limits of scarcity. We invented fire, we invented agriculture, we domesticated animals, we invented plows and fertilizers and exchange and all these things. And of course now, genetically modified seeds that fended off starvation, frankly, and other agricultural improvements around the world. So yeah, we avoided the population bomb. Of course, it was always pretty obvious that we were going to avoid the population bomb. At the time that Ehrlich was writing, fertility was already falling in much of the world. And agricultural yields were already rising at historically unprecedented levels. But it wasn't just Ehrlich saying this. There was a whole zeitgeist at the time. I mean, the U.S. government was expansively supporting family planning programs around the world as part of an effort to fight communism. Because the belief was if population growth is too fast, there will be excess laborers who will be unhappy with their lot in life and they will fuel communist revolutions. So lots of people had lots of reasons to be interested in this overpopulation argument, when the reality is underpopulation is a much more severe threat. This one, it's not that we're just going to run out of food. It's not that the technology is just going to, suddenly stop working, but there will be real economic challenges associated with long-term low fertility, real social challenges, and we do not currently have a ready solution on hand, and there's no underlying social trend pointing in an obvious direction to offset falling fertility.
Lyman, putting together some of my notes for this program, I did a quick internet search about organizations that are dedicated to reducing the world population, and there's a whole bunch of them in this country, internationally. And their goal is to decrease the world population. So here's a few names: the International Planned Parenthood, the Population Institute, of course, the United Nations Population Fund. And listen to what their mission is. Their mission is to deliver a world where every pregnancy is wanted, every childbirth is safe, and every young person's potential is fulfilled. Now that sounds good. I think we could all be in favor of that. But one of the threads that runs true for all of these groups is that they are working for depopulation, if you will, under the guise of reproductive health and reproductive rights, and which essentially that's translated to mean abortion. All of these groups are pro-abortion groups. They have the belief, again, that there's too many people, but they've somehow convinced women in particular that a pregnancy or a child could hold you back. And they've convinced not just women as individuals, but they've convinced entire societies that too many people, and that really children are holding you back to reach your full potential, like the United Nations Population Fund is saying here.
It's important to talk about this whole wantedness element. Because obviously we do want people to achieve their family goals. Okay. And if somebody says, I want 0 children, I don't want to force them to have kids that they don't want to have. Partly because we also know sociologically that if somebody doesn't want kids and then they have a child, that child's odds of experiencing early death and child abuse are much higher. So it's not that we want to make people have unwanted kids or something, but it's amazing how groups like UNFPA that you mentioned, they say where every pregnancy is wanted. And they see that as saying by getting rid of unwanted pregnancies. Okay. But you could also say by changing the circumstances of family and pregnancy such that those pregnancies become wanted. Right? They only see one side of this, and that's reducing pregnancy to match wantedness. And it's beyond their imagination that maybe there are problems in society that you could fix that would cause wantedness, the number of pregnancies that people are comfortable and happy with, to rise. Beyond that, it's worth noting that the share of pregnancies that people report wanting, that is, that are intended, you might think in Africa, 70% of pregnancies are unwanted, but in America, only 20% of pregnancies are unwanted. No. In Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in the US, around the world, a pretty more or less stable 35 to 45% of pregnancies are unwanted. That is, societies with widespread abortion and contraception have about the same rate of unwantedness in their pregnancies as societies with relatively little contraception and abortion. So the Band-Aid that groups like UNFPA propose to put on the question of wantedness, that is contraception and abortion, we know it doesn't work. Okay, we know that in fact, expansion of usage of contraception and abortion in society is not actually associated with a dramatic change in wantedness of pregnancies. Rather, if you actually want to help achieve that goal, which I think is not an unreasonable goal, that every pregnancy is wanted, okay, you might instead look at underlying social and family conditions that generate unwantedness and try to address them. And the biggest underlying condition is, like you were saying, this perception that children are a burden. And there's a reality to that perception that, yes, when you have kids, it's very disruptive to your childless life. You socialize differently, you work differently. It changes lots of things. That's true. That's a real cost, but there's also the question of how we socially think about that cost and the kinds of norms and values and attitudes that we teach to people in health and educational systems.
Yeah, and our norms and values and attitudes towards children and family have radically changed, particularly since the 1960s. And these attitudes and values correspond with the decreasing birth rate. Today in the United States of America, there are 1.66 children per woman. In 1960, it was 3.58 children per woman. So we've seen a drastic decline in the birth rate here. We're seeing less family formation in the United States today. Fewer people are getting married. People are getting married at an older age. So we've seen a lot of our attitudes towards family and children and marriage have changed. Lyman, here's the question. Is this a result to public policy primarily, or is it a result of just the cultural mores, cultural attitudes, influence of popular culture, if you will, on our attitudes towards families and children? So is it policy, or is it just this cultural influence that we're in?
I'm tempted to say it's both, but the truth is there's no difference between the two, right? We live in a democracy where the policy that we get is a product of, or we live in a republic, where the policy that we get is a product of the votes that people cast. And the reason they cast those votes is because they're part of a popular culture that gives them certain ideas and values and attitudes. And the reason we have that popular culture is partly because of the government we have and the kinds of rules of the road that it sets for how society works. So it's not really, I don't think it's actually very productive to distinguish between cultural things and policy things, or cultural things and economic factors, because they work together, right? So think about something like education. People tend not to have children while they are enrolled in school. It tends to be a very strong social norm to not have children while in school. If they do have a child while in school, they tend to drop out. Is that just basic economic structure, or is that culture? Well, it's both. Obviously, the existence of school is a kind of policy thing. It changes the kinds of opportunities and earnings options that people have later in life, which changes like the timing of their life, right? They get married later because they're in school longer, and then they have to get more skills after school. And okay. At the same time, it's something cultural, right? The Amish choose not to put their kids in school. The Mormons choose to have many of their kids take a year off or 2 years off to go be missionaries, kind of in the middle of college or just before college. Culture and economics go hand in hand. We can't separate the two. So yes, there are policy elements, particularly we could think related to housing, where we excessively regulate construction of new housing. And make it basically impossible to build affordable housing that's suitable for families, and through policy choices. And then there's also cultural things where a lot of developers, still thinking on housing here, a lot of real estate developers could be building more family-friendly housing. And if they did so, it probably would sell. Not probably, it would sell. But they don't, because there's a culture of risk aversion and wanting to only build built forms that you've built a million times before. So they're code compliant, where to get all the different elements of the process completed, and then you don't have to learn something new. So there is culture and there is policy, and distinguishing between the two is very difficult because culture causes policy and policy causes culture.
Kentucky is at a crossroads. We can choose to give in to the radical left, or we can choose to engage the culture in a God-honoring way.
I started the Commonwealth Policy Center because I believe that Christians have a responsibility to influence government and society to the glory of God. While the Commonwealth Policy Center's made a significant impact, our work isn't finished. If you'd like to join our movement working for timeless values, then head to our website.
To learn more, go to commonwealthpolicycenter.org.
If you are just joining us, you're tuned into the Commonwealth Matters. I'm Richard Nelson, your host, talking with guest Lyman Stone about demographics. Lyman, let's look at governmental policy. Are there policies in place that discourage family formation? And because we know that when a man and woman get married, they're more likely to have children. So do we have marriage discouraging public policies on the books right now in the United States?
We absolutely do. The most prominent examples of this are just marriage penalties in our tax and welfare code. So usually these happen in means tested programs. So like the earned income tax credit, or food stamps, or Section 8 housing, or like the CHIP program or Medicaid. So what happens in these programs is basically the government says, okay, you are low income, you're a poor parent, something like that. We're going to give you these benefits, provided that your income is below a certain level. And then if you get married to someone else who's also poor and they're also getting those benefits, you then would combine your incomes. But now your incomes, because you're married, have risen above the threshold for for a married couple, or they're farther up the phase out pattern, or you're still under the threshold, but the size of the credit or the benefit doesn't double. And the result is we actually have a situation where for working class people in particular, for people, who have some income, but they're not middle or upper class, they often face losing thousands of dollars or tens of thousands of dollars worth of benefits if they get married. This is especially true for single parents. Single parents, single moms or single dads, face massive marriage penalties. And I don't just mean like, oh, they get a little bit less money, but a situation where they say, okay, if I marry the father of my child will lose their health insurance. Like what kind of choice do you expect a parent to make? Trade off their kid having health care or having a piece of paper that says they're married to this person? So marriage penalties have a huge discouraging effect on marriage. We know this from decades of high quality academic study. These can be alleviated, although it's complicated to do so and it's sometimes costly. But right now, there's actually a proposal. It just released as we are recording this, as it happens. Senator Romney released a federal proposal to reform the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, and a couple of other pieces of the tax code in a way that substantially reduces marriage penalties. And also, as it happens, extends the child tax credit to pregnancies. So there are options to do this. They can be done. It's a bit complicated, and it does require us to think a little bit more carefully about how we design a lot of our programs. Beyond that, I mentioned housing. Obviously, we need to be making it easy and affordable to build family-suitable housing. I live in Lexington. I live in a neighborhood that it's got single-family houses. It has duplexes. It has apartments. It's one of the densest. It's in the top 5% densest neighborhoods in Kentucky. And yet, I have a yard, a garage, a driveway. There's ample street parking, and yet I can also walk to restaurants, walk to a library. The point is, you can build neighborhoods that are dense, that make effective use of land, that are profitable for developers, that are desirable to live in, that are walkable and all these things that like young people want, and also that are not just, blocks of, 5/1 apartment buildings.
Yeah. Lexington has very strict land use controls. In fact, they keep everything within the circle, New Circle Road, I guess. To build outside of that area is very, very difficult.
Especially on the north side. I'm on the south side of Lexington where the green belt doesn't apply. It's interesting though, because there's some things Lexington's actually lacks on. So my home county, Jessamine County, in the town I'm from, Wilmore, does not allow any ADUs, accessory dwelling units, right? So I had a friend who his aging in-laws wanted to move to be closer. He's got 7 acres he's got 7 acres within a city limits. He wanted to build a little house for them to live on the back half of his property. And it's totally illegal. He can't do it. He had to parcel off a chunk of his property, which was complicated. Whereas me in Lexington, I can put an ADU in my backyard. On the other hand, in Lexington, you want to actually just like build a neighborhood? Sorry, you can't do it. Whereas Wilmore, where I'm from, as long as the lots are 1/3 of an acre or bigger, or 3/4 of an acre or bigger, as long as they're these big lots, you can build it. But most people don't actually want to mow 3/4 of an acre, right? They'd be happy with a slightly smaller lot size as long as they still have a decent yard, But regulations prevent them from doing that. So there are all these complications. It's all very complicated. But at the end of the day, it's an unreasonable restriction on private property rights to say to landowners, it's one thing if we're talking about nuisance things like allowed, like a concert venue or a business that has lots of traffic or something like that. But if we're just talking about normal residences, it's absurd that we don't allow private property owners to build reasonable, safe residences on their property as they like.
So Lyman, we're talking over regulation, infringing on private property rights, but there's another part of this discussion too, in that home values have skyrocketed just in the last few years. And it's very, very difficult for young people who maybe they're married, but they're thinking, I can't afford a home, and I especially can't afford children. Aren't children expensive? I mean, is this one reason why we're seeing a decrease in the population, the birth rate in this country? Is it because kids are too expensive? Speak to that if you would.
Yeah, so there are a lot of costs with kids. Housing is the biggest one because kids generally need space. And it is true that when housing becomes costlier, fertility falls. That's true. And Lexington was recently rated one of the 10 least affordable cities in the nation for young people in terms of house prices versus local incomes for people under 35. So Lexington's kind of ground zero for this kind of dynamic. But it's important to keep in mind that cost of raising children is not just budget costs. It's also social norms. Okay, so I have 3 kids. 2 of them are sharing a bedroom. The other one is a baby and she's in a walk-in closet. Once she moves out of that closet, she's going to move into the same bedroom with the other 2. Okay, because my wife and I have just decided we are okay with bunk beds. That's fine. We want to have a lot of kids. And bunk beds are how you do that. You just stack them in a room. And we like having guest bedrooms and a home office and playrooms and stuff like that. And we only have so many bedrooms. So you make do. But a lot of Americans think, no, every child needs their own bedroom because they have a cultural norm around individualism, privacy, these kinds of values. Untangling the economy and the values is hard because once that social norm exists that children need their own private space, if you have that, and I'm not saying that's a good or bad norm, I'm just saying it's a common norm. Once you have that norm, housing is way more expensive because for a given number of children, you need a lot more housing. So that means that when that individualistic, privacy-oriented norm for children arises, housing costs become even more important for shaping fertility. Whereas people who just say, I don't care if my kids have privacy, I'm going to stack 6 of them in a room, whatever. Which also, as it happens, is there's also regulations here, right? So it used to be totally legal to put as many kids as you want in a room. Now we have occupancy laws, right? That there are limits on how many kids you can put in a room. And you talk to any family that's ever had an encounter with Child Protective Services. And of course, CPS does a lot of important and good work, removing kids from abusive situations that they need to be removed from. And some people would argue maybe there's a lot of abusive situations we should be removing more kids from. Okay, maybe. At the same time, the reality is, and I'm not sure if this is the case in Kentucky, but there are a lot of states where once CPS has been called, even if they find that the reason for the call was not valid, they can remove children from their parents simply for violations of occupancy rules or for not having one room per child. So these norms that we have end up impacting law and policy, which impacts people's real family life. And so if you're a family, like maybe a minority family that tends to get CPS called on them more for all sorts of reasons, and you're worried about CPS getting called on you, then you're even more sensitive to the question, these kinds of questions. So the interaction between culture and policy is really important. And this is why people often think, well, low fertility, it's not because of economics, we're richer than we've ever been, it's because of culture. Or they'll say, no, it's not just because of culture. I mean, fertility's fallen by a huge amount in just 20 years. Culture didn't change that fast. Well, the answer is it's both. It's an interaction between the two. It takes 2 to tango, with kids and with falling fertility.
Lyman, are you aware of any research that measures the happiness of couples that have children as opposed to couples that don't, or even individuals who never got married? The reason I'm asking this is because a case has been made that, like we're talking about, kids are a burden, they're a lot of work, they're expensive, and you're going to have a less fulfilled life if you have children. That's the cultural narrative anyway. But is there research? I'm aware of anecdotes. I can speak personally on this, but are you aware of any research that speaks to human happiness, those couples that have children compared to those who are childless?
Yeah, there is. And in general, it's consistent with the idea that children have a modestly positive effect on happiness. Modestly, it's not huge, okay? But what I will say is that research actually has a big problem because not all children are the same, okay? In particular, there's a big difference between a person who was trying to conceive a child and they wanted that child and then they have the child and they get it, and a person who did not want to have a child and then finds themselves to be pregnant. Those may have very different effects. And we actually know this because there are some surveys where we can look at this and we can see that if for people who want a child and they have a child, it has a large positive effect on happiness, and that effect lasts quite a long time. Okay. And on the other hand, people who want a child and don't have it, so like the classic case of this where we can look at like random failure to have a child is with IVF failures. So people who use IVF and then do not succeed to have a child versus similar people who use IVF and do have a child. IVF failure is associated with a considerable increase in prescription of antidepressants, antipsychotics, and anti-anxiety medications. So that tells us that, yeah, wanting a kid and not having it is associated with a lot worse mental health. We have a variety of studies that show that wanting a kid and having it is associated with a happiness increase. But what about people who don't want a kid and then have it? For those people, we see that there is a decline in happiness in the short run. In the long run, there's no big effect either way on happiness for those people. Though I did mention earlier, unwanted children have higher rates of adverse outcomes of a variety of kinds. So what we can say is the evidence is a bit mixed on just children in general. And the evidence suggests that when people say they don't want to have kids, that they do mean it, and trying to bully them into having kids they don't want isn't great for anybody. But for people who want kids, yeah, having kids is associated with a lot of happiness and value and satisfaction in life. And if you want kids and you're not able to fulfill that want, it's associated with a lot of disappointment and sadness in life and getting to the end of your reproductive years with a sense of something missing.
Yeah, very good. Lyman, I want us to talk about the current U.S. population, the decline in population growth in the United States, and what this means for the future. So currently, the U.S. population is at 345 million. Over the next 75 years, it's only projected to be 366 million, which is really very, very little growth in our overall population. So the age pyramid right now in this country looks like a column. Healthy societies generally will have a population pyramid with a lot of younger people at the bottom, the elderly at the top. But we don't see that. In fact, within 75 years, it's going to be an inverted period, if I understand correctly. What does this mean for our economic health? What does it mean for the younger people in our society? What does that look like when you have an inverted demographic pyramid?
When you have very few young people and lots of older people, which is where we're headed in the long run at current fertility rates, you have a lot of results. So the ones people think of that are obvious are things like Social Security and Medicare, right? You have fewer taxpayers, more people claiming. The result is either you have to cut benefits for old people or you have to raise taxes on young people. And if you do either of those, if you cut benefits for old people, that reduces consumption demand, economic demand, and that means slower economic growth. Or on the other hand, if you raise taxes on working age people, that means less return to work, less incentive to innovate and all these things, and lower economic growth. So either way, you're talking about lower economic growth. You can also think just compositionally, most economic production is by young people, is by working age people. And so as they shrink as a share of the population, the result is lower economic growth. But you can also think about the deep roots of economic growth, which is basically innovation, entrepreneurship, increasing productivity. Well, what drives these things? Well, who does most of the invention of new things? People under the age of 40. Who's fastest to adopt new technologies and new products and therefore help them scale up? People under 40. Who's most likely to start a new business that's going to try something new and try a new type of product? People under 40. As societies age, they become less innovative and less entrepreneurial and less dynamic. They become more monopolistic. Older people are more likely to stick with familiar brands and less likely to go with new brands. And the result is that existing brands have more market power. They become less competitive, more monopolistic, less innovative. If you think about it just in terms of inheritance, if you think of wealth in our society, a society where wealth is divided between more children is a society that will, in the long run, have more wealth equality, whereas a society where wealth is more concentrated because there's only one heir is a society where inherited wealth will become a larger share of the wealth in society and lead to more of the rise of essentially an inherited aristocracy. So broadly speaking, what we can say is that low fertility will generate a society of greater inequality, less entrepreneurship, less innovation, and less dynamism, and therefore lower economic growth, and therefore lower living standards for everyone.
Lyman, what does this mean for some of our social safety net programs like Medicare, health insurance for the elderly, and Social Security? Social Security, as it is slated to go belly up or not be able to make payouts to those people who will be receiving benefits in 9 years. What does that look like in 20 or 30 years if we see this continued inverted demographic period? I mean, does Social Security go away in 50 years? Because you've got a smaller workforce paying into it and sustaining a larger number of people. What does that look like down the line?
It won't go away. There's still going to be something. The question is just, will we raise taxes or will we cut benefits? And my guess is some of both. But it's going to be a lot of instability. And I think, if you're looking at retiring in the next 10 years or later, next 20 years, then you should be planning for a smaller Social Security check, or for lower quality Medicare services. Because that's just, maybe taxes will be raised to pay for it, but I would also assume there's going to be some cost management measures as well. Now, higher fertility in the short run doesn't solve that, because if you just have more babies today, it takes them 25 years to become taxpayers. So 9 years from now, and in fact, in the meantime, you pay for their education, so you actually lose money in the meantime. In the long run, though, it is part of a solution. In fact, it's a very important part. Fertility changes have a huge effect. The Social Security Trust Fund shows this. Fertility changes have a huge effect on the long-run balance of the Social Security Trust Fund. And not just that, but because changing the age composition of the workforce will also change productivity growth, which is not a dynamic that the Social Security Trust Fund, that their reports even model, but it's real. The effect of fertility on long-run viability of these programs is actually even bigger than they let on.
Lyman, I'd like to move to a discussion on the demographic cliff in China. Absolute disaster there. Of course, we know that they had the one-child policy for decades. They've had other policies that discouraged larger families before that. Currently, China has a population of 1.42 billion. But according to researchers at the Shanghai Academy of Social Sciences and Victoria University, China is projected to have just 525 million in the year 2100. That's just 75 years from now. That is a 60% decrease. They are facing a major cultural shift. What does this mean for China? What is the economic cost? What is the cost to their societies and human flourishing, and the economy, which is the second largest economy in the world? What does this look like for China down the line?
I mean, it's obviously a problem. It's all the types of problems we've already been talking about, stagnation and growth, and they're already having growth stagnation right now. I mean, China's economic growth has slowed down dramatically in the last few years. China's benefited from what's called close following. That is, they do a lot of innovation, but most of the innovation they do is kind of around the edges. It's just behind the leader. the US, right? So they do a lot of innovation to catch up, which is easier. What we can guess is because they're facing this huge decline in the number of young researchers they'll have, although they still have rapidly rising educational attainment as well. So the number of high quality college graduates in China is still going to rise for some time. But in the next 30 or 40 years, as this decline sets in, China's not going to catch up and become the new research leader in general across lots of fields. They're just not going to, because so many of their young people are going to be occupied caring for their old people. And this is already happening. It's called the 4-2-1 problem in China. Lots of young Chinese people talk about this. You'll have 1 grandchild, 2 in the parent generation, and 4 in the grandparent generation, right? And the result of it is just that 1 grandchild, when they grow up, has an enormous care burden, right? They're taking care of so many people. So then they don't want to have kids because they're already doing so much, and they really barely have time for anything. So the result is Chinese people just already feel very overworked, stressed out, exhausted. And so I'm skeptical that China is going to, continue experiencing the rapid economic growth that it has for a while. And I don't think they're going to overtake us as like the world's sort of major research hub. Now, at the same time, we shouldn't exaggerate. They still have 1.4 billion people, and they're still going to have over 1 billion for many years to come. By 2100, it's possible, if the US finds a way to solve our low fertility problem, and if we continue to get high immigration, it's possible we will have similar population as China, 80 years from now. A lot can happen in 80 years. A war with China in between would involve us at a massive manpower disadvantage. So we shouldn't rest on our laurels and act like, well, because the line's going down for China, we don't have to worry. They're a paper tiger. No, they're still an enormous country with lots of resources, lots of power, and just absolutely massive industrial base, which is really important for the intrinsically physical experience of warfare. As we've seen in Ukraine, even a modestly scaled war is straining the defense industrial base of the Western world. And so that is a serious concern, because it suggests that whatever happens with China demographically, there's still going to be a titanic challenge in the next century.
Lyman, under China's one-child policy, families often, they would learn that they were going to have a daughter, and they would practice sex-selective abortions. And right now there's a huge imbalance, the male to female ratio in China. How much has that played into their crashing population? There's a lot of men, it's in the millions. I don't have the number at my fingertips. It's a large number. A lot of men that aren't finding wives, and it's because women have been aborted, girls have been aborted. How much has this played into their population crash that's on the horizon here?
Yeah, I mean, it makes it more severe because men don't have babies. So their decline is more severe than it might look on its face, right? Because at any given time, the number of actual reproductive age women in a cohort is unusually small. And that's a big part of what's driving this long run decline, is just that it's not just that they have low fertility on average. It's maybe 1 child per woman on average in China right now. It's that there's just fewer women to have those kids to begin with.
Very good. I want to bring it back to the United States here and some of the trends we're seeing, and then we'll close it out in a few minutes. But you recently wrote an article about blue state families. You say that they are migrating to red and purple states because it's cheaper to live in the red states than it is in the blue states. And now, what effect is this going to have on regional regional demographics? We'll just start there. Are we seeing the effects where blue states are seeing less families, less children? Are they feeling the effect there, first of all? And then what is the effect on the red states that these blue state families are moving into?
Yeah, I mean, fertility tends to be higher in conservative areas. That's true at the state level, at the county level, whatever level. It just is the case that conservatives tend to have more children. Um, but nonetheless, there are lots, people have kids everywhere. And we are seeing on net in recent years that families with kids have disproportionately moved away from blue states like California, Minnesota, New York, Washington, Oregon, Illinois, things like that, towards red states, Texas, Florida, Kentucky, Utah, Idaho, take your pick. So the upshot here is one, yeah, red states have cheaper housing, but we don't actually think that's the whole story. That's definitely part of it. But of course, cheap housing, there's cheap housing my wife's from Ashland, Kentucky. There's cheap housing in Ashland, but not a lot of people are moving to Ashland because Ashland has cheap housing, but unfortunately it doesn't have a lot of jobs and has other quality of life issues. People wouldn't move to red states if all it was cheap housing, right? It's cheap housing alongside generally good quality of life, right? Reasonable jobs, a sense that maybe crime is not quite as severe or is better handled, or public disorder maybe. Schooling obviously is a huge factor for a lot of families. And if you can move to a different state and get a voucher for private school, people will move for that. They absolutely will move for that. That is a lot of money on the line for a lot of families. Or even aside from vouchers, the types of content that's in the public schools. People will absolutely move to get their child away from content they find deeply objectionable. So we think what's happening is that in general, as Democrats and more generally kind of ideological liberals become more selectively identified with singleness and childlessness, which is true. This is the gap between conservatives and liberals is becoming more severe on this question. The result is that blue states are also just becoming less amenable to the kinds of life that families want to have for their kids. And the result is this filtering on family status.
Lyman, I'd like to close with this question to you. If you were to advise our governor and our state legislature as to policies that would be more family friendly, that would create the formation of marriage, and that would encourage the more bearing of children, what would you tell them? What would be a couple of things? I know we touched on things earlier, but specifically at the state level, what would you shared earlier in the program regarded a lot of federal policies, the earned income tax credit and things like that. But what would be a couple of things that you would do to encourage, again, family formation and to increase the birth rate?
Yeah. So a lot of federal policies actually have state variation in implementation. So things like Medicaid, CHIP, housing programs, TAMF, SNAP, all have different elements of state participation. And I would say insofar as Kentucky has the ability to set eligibility rules and things like that, we should be making sure that we're not creating marriage penalties, trying to eliminate them. Two, we have some tax provisions that are more generous for families in Kentucky, but we could have a state child tax credit, a state earned income tax credit, though for an EITC, you want to make sure you don't create marriage penalties. But really where the states really have the most leverage is on regulations, and particularly in two areas. One, housing. The state government could use a mixture of carrots and sticks to encourage counties and municipalities to allow building of features that we know are good family accommodations, ADUs, modest lot sizes, things like that. You don't necessarily want to just put high rises in random towns, but just allowing, more efficient neighborhoods and allowing property owners to do what they want will discipline house prices and house costs and make things more affordable for young families. Then you can also think about childcare. There's lots of state variation in childcare regulations in terms of, children per adult, in terms of licensure and things like that. I'm working on a study right now. A preprint is already out, but I'm working on a study right now that shows that stricter regulation of childcare has a significant effect on reducing fertility at the state level. And so I would say you should allow a lot of flexibility in childcare. Limit how much regulation we do on certifications and education requirements for childcare. We should think twice about regulations limiting the amount of home-based care that can be provided. And also we should avoid regulations that limit like where you can provide and think carefully about child to staff ratios. Then of course there's education, and in particular vouchers. I'm not sure the current status on this, but I'm hopeful that we will get to vote on a constitutional amendment. It is going to be on the ballot. I hadn't heard finally if it was. So hopefully that passes. Vouchers on net, families tend to prefer. Actually, I have a survey I'm working on right now that we know that families tend to prefer vouchers over average or below average quality public schools. So giving people vouchers is a great way to empower them to have the kind of parenting experience that they want to have. And of course, we also know that school choice does not have a negative effect on public school quality. We have a lot of studies now that show that actually school choice sometimes improves public school quality. I'm very excited. I hope that passes in Kentucky. I think that that'll be a huge boon to families.
Yeah, very good. Lyman Stone, thank you so much for joining us on the Commonwealth Matters, and thank you all for tuning in. Until next time, may God bless you.